Why you guys are standing one side? Please feel free to have a seat. And somebody, could you go to YouTube to make sure the video is on and the audio is on? On and on. On. Just wait a minute. Let me just put my screen. Check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. There, do you hear sound? Check, check. Yes, yeah, I hear that. All right, so thank you for coming. This is the Tokyo.net Developer Meetup, 45th, I guess. Yes, no, I don't know. Yes. And today we have the one guest speaker, Alex from the Inedo, and Inedo is actually the long sponsor for this event. That's why we have the nice gorgeous pizza. What did you say, Jim? The pizza, what's the name? Sub-normal pizza?
Semi-normal pizza.
Semi-normal. what does it mean, semi-normal pizza?
It means like almost normal.
Okay, so semi-normal pizza meaning almost normal. So we have almost normal pizza, meaning something strange.
It's better than usual.
From the United States point of view, right? For the Japanese point of view, that pizza is just normal. It's okay, right? And after Alex is talking, I don't know how much the Alex will be using the time. 40 minutes, 50 minutes?
I have potentially a lot of content. But
all right, yeah, just talk as much as you want. If there is some time remains, I will talk about the .NET roadmap, which I just stole from the Build 2019. Meaning you can just go to Build 2019 to watch the video. You don't have to. I don't have to repeat. And we also have the not the guest speaker, but the guy from the Hokkaido. Joining the event, seeing it from online. He's Nakamura-san, same family name as me. He's a good friend of mine, and we can see you.
Only you can see.
Yeah, only I can see. Well, do you know what? Actually, I can bring my. But if I do that, it's okay to keep going. But he's Nakamura-san. Nakamura-san.
Hi.
Yeah. You are online.
But he can't see us.
All right, yeah, he only can see me. All right. Anyway, so Alex, it's all okay to you and the microphone. Yes. And I need to pass the control to you, but I don't see you, Alex. You need to log into the Hangout.
Really?
Yeah, because you logged out. Let me invite again.
It says no internet, but
No internet.
Did you log in with the code?
I did, but then I logged out. Then it must have. Yeah, I think I accidentally pressed airplane mode. But now, hold on. It is.
All right, because the code is supposed to be working for a day, so it should be remembering.
Yes.
And please wait until.
Yeah.
All right. Beacons and project everyone. All right. So you are on right now.
Can you see the screen?
No, you gotta
yet?
share.
Oh yeah, because you are not screen. sharing
Your screen sharing. Still says you're doing it.
Okay, sharing.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay.
All right, and could you unmute your mic? I will mute here.
Can you hear the voice in seminar room? I can't hear any sound.
I think I can just, you can just use my mic in that case.
I'll go to one. I find one.
And just mute the speaker over there.
Speaker.
Yeah.
Muted. Okay. Okay, it's perfect.
It's just this. All right. Yeah. Go ahead. So this is your mic now.
This is a good mic.
This is your mic.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Sorry for waiting. Sorry for keep you waiting.
All right. So, and let me start this. Okay. Can you hear me now and see me good enough? Okay, perfect. Oh, thank you. So, yeah, today I wanted to talk about how we built our totally custom web framework from the ground up, which is a rare thing to say, and how it worked so well for us. First, I'll give you just a little bit of background on me. I am the founder and CEO of Anito and have been really just focusing in the past few years on not at all writing software whatsoever. In fact, just this past week or two was the first time I installed Visual Studio in years. So I am not really a coder anymore, but I am. Like, it's something that I can never leave. I enjoy writing code almost too much. When I was doing some research for this sort of presentation, I just found myself, it was like 4 a.m. Sunday morning, and I'm like, oh, that's a crow. Shoot, what's going on? So anyways, I get addicted to code sometimes, but I don't really code anymore. But one of the reasons I wanted to share about this is because at Anito, we have a totally custom web framework. And so this isn't something that is necessarily advertised on the job descriptions, on any of the posts. So when you start a new job at any company, it sort of looks like this. Here's the employee handbook. It tells you about how to get your health care, all of your other benefits. Oh, okay. Here's our process guides and all your logins to check into like GitHub and GitLab and all the other tools that we use, right? Coffee makers here, Scotch library is there, please only after 6 o'clock, so on forth. And oh, by the way, we have our own custom totally web framework. Every time somebody just gives us this look, and maybe you are probably thinking the same thing, why would you build your own web framework? That sounds really stupid, especially in the past at least 10 years, nobody would ever do that. Well, so the answers are this, right? One of the things as a product company, we have multiple web products that are installable and on-prem. And one thing that's very important to us is to have a standardization of user experience. You think about that from different products from different companies that you've used, and one of their web products looks different. Like I know Atlassian, for example. Their Confluence and Jira kind of look like they have the same logos, but they're a little bit different. The other problem with different products having different experiences are from the developers too. So if we want multiple developers working on we want one developer working on multiple products because they interact. So if they don't remember which web framework is in which tool, it's a problem. A big thing for us is we want developers without front-end experience to build web interfaces. Most of our applications are web-based, but when you think about web pages, very little of it has to be really, really UI heavy. Most of it's just basically enter information in a form and hit the submit button. Validation, those things. Another thing that was big was to reduce runtime errors through static and compile verification. This way, we don't discover bugs when it's in the field or when you test it. The compiler tells us right away, hey, you've got a problem. And then this is a big one too. I just learned about something today called Blazor. I didn't know about this, but say it's going to be a good thing. I have no idea if it is. I don't have a lot of hope based on my experience in the past 10 years, but we don't have to worry about any of that stuff because we have our own web platform and we never have to re-platform because we own all of those decisions under it. So the other thing that's important about anytime you build anything, it comes from an opinionated place. So there's this idea of people say we make opinionated software. Our web framework is based on my rigorous opinions. Because I designed it. I originally designed all of our products about 8 years ago, something like that. But I'll tell you where my opinions came from. So my very first web application was almost 20 years ago, which is a long time. It was a pretty cool website where users would write their own interactive stories. It was kind of like choose your own adventure books, if you remember those, but for the web. Actually, for its time, it was really, really cool. So since many people haven't been developing websites for the past 10 years, let alone for the past 20 years, I want to walk you through what ancient web architecture looks like. So, like most sites of its time, it used a web server that listened on TCP IP. What it would do is it would sort of listen for it communicated in hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP. We know all this, and essentially all the input was it was always a relative file path. So index, assets, logo, and the output was usually that file on disk. You're seeing this is basically not that much changed. So back in the day, this is how you would do almost all web development. It was just like files on disk. It was a static web server. But then, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago, something like that, somebody invented the Common Gateway Interface. So that's CGI programming. Has anyone done CGI? It's some ancient stuff, right? It was really interesting. Here's how it works. So if you can first picture a web server like Apache just serving, you send it a URL request and then it serves back the file to you. What CGI did was it was a special type of request. And you have seen these, right? Yes. CGI bin. And what happened is the web server would specifically listen for that. If CGI bin, then it would do something else. And here's what it would do. It just would invoke a script, almost always Perl. So you look at those old websites, CGI bin by something, something PL. All this Perl script would do would take the raw request, which is an input stream, and send the request out to the output stream. Typically, this Perl script would output some kind of HTML, but it really could be anything. Sometimes it'd be a file, an image, or anything like that. So with CGI technology, you could now build server-based applications. The next interesting piece of technology that came out was SSI. This is server-side includes. So this is another really cool web server feature back in the day. Again, probably at least 25 years old. How it worked was this: you would embed these sort of special tags inside of your HTML, and the web server would just sort of be writing out that file as it goes, see something like this, who knows what the format is, and then it would, depending on what the tag was, it would just grab that file from disk. In this case, it's HTML, so it's going to grab that file, process it, or maybe it's a script, so it will run that script just like it were CGI bin. That is how the ancient web of 25 years ago worked. 20 years later, in my experience, I've now built countless web applications. I've used tons and tons of different platforms over the year, worked with everything from everything on top of Java to .NET. Primarily, everything's been .NET. And I've had the opportunity to write about even more bad software at the Daily WTF. So through my career, I have seen it all, and especially some of the really, really bad stuff at WTF. My feeling then is that the software fundamentals were the same 50 years ago. This idea of how we built software 50 years ago is the same, and the way that software will be built in 50 years from now will be the same. People will write code, we will build it, we will test it, we will compile it. The web fundamentals will always have some of these same things that we saw 20 years ago will be the same 20 years in the future. So here's my, again, strong opinions about what the future looks like of web technology 20 years from now. HTTP will remain the main communication protocol that browsers use. Sure, we're going to have things like WebSocket. We're going to have other things, but they will always be an augmentation on top of HTTP. There were many augmentations on the past, by the way, that were always sidestepped to HTTP. Some of those were in the 2000s, 2005s, but HTTP is what will remain the same. HTML will remain the standard will always be hierarchical, and it will always be what browsers use. We've seen many technologies over the past 20 years come and go. Flash, can't forget that. WebGL was really fun. Canvas, I guess people use that now. I've just heard about this. I don't even know what Blazor is, if that is something that is supposed to supplement HTML.
Or more broadly, WebAssembly.
A WebAssembly. You know, so that's like a JavaScript, but it's just an augmentation on all of this stuff. What's that?
Silverlight.
So, oh, sorry, I didn't want to remind you about Silverlight, Shockwave, but everything back to the basics. 25 years ago, you could build entirely in HTML, and you will 20 years from now. So the other thing that's fundamental here is the way that people want to use the web and how they will use the web, no matter what you do. I remember 15 years ago websites, and also Japanese websites today, have a great feature that says, do not use the back button of your browser. And everyone does, and then the website doesn't work. And it turns out people like to bookmark. People expect bookmarking. I don't care how you make a website, whether it's in Flash, whether it's in Silverlight, Canvas, whether it's in any new technology. Users want bookmarks, pages, and back buttons. That will always remain the same. So that is how I see, you know, some of these new designs like single page applications, you can see go against a lot of these things. Users don't want that. They want the back button, just like they did 15 years ago. They're going to want it 20 years from now. So what is software going to look like in 50 years from now, which is well, long after, like, all of us will be retired, I think. So I think 50 years ago, they learned that strong static typing was the easiest way to ensure quality. That's why it was invented, right? And that's why it will still be the easiest and early way. When your browser, when your code editor, when your compiler tells you, hey, an integer or whatever should be an integer, then you'll know it. Some very code patterns that I think I've read about these in the 70s, from books from the 70s. Tightly coupled logical tiers remain useless. I've written a lot about this over the years. One of it is this idea where you have a web layer, then you have a business logic layer, then you have a data access layer, and then a database layer, all just to save a username to databases. It adds no value because they're tightly coupled, and any developer wanting to make a change will have to make a change to the entire stack. So that's another design opinion. The other thing I believe is that tightly coupled code needs to be as close as possible. So what I mean by this is when you have two very dependent files, maybe it's I don't know, two C# files that may as well just be the same class, doesn't matter what language or technology, they should be as physically close to each other, because what's going to happen is a developer is going to edit it here and then have no idea that he was supposed to edit this other project that had this other file, because who would have thought they were that far apart in the code? I've seen this a problem for at least 20 years, and it was a problem back when they were doing punch cards too. And lastly, I think that loose coupling and modularity is a key to maintaining large code bases. Again, a battle 50 years ago, 50 years from now, massive code bases are serious problems, and the way to break those down are to split into modules that can be independently coupled. A lot of the early guys of software quality talked about this, and that was a problem then. NuGet, you see, is one of the solutions today that's trying to solve this problem, but it's always been like this, and it always will be like this. So where does all this come together? Well, I apply all of my opinions about what the web will be in 20 years, what it was 20 years ago, what software was 50 years ago, 50 years from now, and I've thought, well, this therefore is what a web framework should have. First, it needs to be stateless because the web is stateless. HTTP is and will always be a stateless protocol. HTML is another very key element of it. And modeled and pages have to be a key part of this whole thing. Tightly coupled code really should be close together. So in the web, this is the JavaScript, CSS, HTML, all of these files. Like think about web applications now that you may write. If you've got like your, I don't know, your the C# controller file or something like that, some server-side logic file is here, then your HTML view is in a totally different folder there. Then your CSS file for that page specifically is here. And then your JavaScript is there. Getting somebody to try to understand how to navigate all of these things is going to be a problem. They won't remember to do that, and they will be very frustrated navigating the code base. I have very strong opinions about strong typing. It's almost like a kind of religion to me. I demand everything is strong typed. I do not like loose typing. So what that means with the web is, I'll explain that. The other thing I thought for the web frameworks is this idea of functional cohesion. So this is a serious problem that I've found in websites for the past 20 years. When you have what pages, don't care how you use them, pages are always going to have URLs like this. Which URL are you supposed to use? Do you is it app ID? Is it what build? How are you supposed to figure out how to navigate from one page to another? That is this idea of functional cohesion instead of just always building up strings with what you believe it should be using loose typing strings. And then the last part is fully modularized components through libraries. In the web world, that sort of means like we have widgets in like, I don't know, UI widgets. That's an example of a component. Everything that you develop inside of a web, a page itself should be modularized as a component library. So, like I said, my very strong opinions about the web framework. And over the years, my first experience in doing, I think, I'm trying to go back, like I did a lot of classic ASP stuff. So that's sort of where I started after CGI bin. That was like in university. But I really got into classic ASP componentization. What was interesting is that they really kept the server-side stuff very close. Like if you've used classic ASP, PHP, any of those things, your server-side code and HTML are just right next to each other. So that's cool. It met that requirements. It's not statically typed, big problem. And there's basically no way to make it modular. The language, the thing that I really, really liked when it came out, what was this, 2002-ish? I don't remember, somewhere around then, was web forms. .NET, ASP.NET web forms. This may have been one of my favorite technologies to ever have been developed on the web, but it still had a lot of problems with it. Well, sure, if you remember the ASPX files and the ASPX.cs files, they were like, some was static, some wasn't. There was this generation logic. The other thing that they really did nice is that modularity. You could actually have controls inside of libraries. So that was pretty cool. My experience with model-driven development, the M's, right? And this is from before ASP MVC, was that they did try to keep HTML and CSS close, but they keep introducing unnecessary tiers, like the model, view, model. 3 tiers for one thing also creates challenging modularity as well. Single-page applications, I feel like it really do like a whole talk on just how terrible they are. But, you know, I'll maybe rant about that over beer someday. So, like I said, all opinions. So when you build a framework, you have to have opinions. These are the opinions that I worked with when sort of doing this. So this is where the Anita web framework sort of was born out of, all of these opinions that I've developed. We call it AH Web. It was originally, you know, names evolve all the time, advanced HTTP handling. So I'll walk you through what the basics of this library is, and then I'll dig into the details. So so our library has very, very minimal dependencies. First, everything we do is C#.NET. We're currently pegged to version 4.5. because as a product company, we have to ensure minimum compatibility. So we don't get to just use the latest version that people have to install on their servers because it's all on-prem. So anyways, so minimal dependencies is just basically C# and .NET. We take dependencies on the network stack in .NET and their how they process worker requests, which if you've done ASP.NET programming, you never even see the worker request. There's HTTP request, then there's worker request, which is usually handled outside of the web process. As I mentioned, I've loved ASP.NET web forms, so there's a lot of inspiration that came from that. Some of the things that I learned that Microsoft has introduced over the years, we've had for years. The way that Web API, when I first saw the technology preview, I'm like, oh, that's cool. We kind of have something just like that. Some of the features from MVC, like the way that they do attribute-based routing, I'm like, cool. I guess now somebody won't have that much of a learning curve when they come to work for Anito because they may be familiar with that. And then the other thing is when I explain some of this, the overview is very simplified. This is, I did grab some of the code, but it is not entirely the code because it's, slightly more complex. Okay, so the other thing, this is sort of how we introduce this framework to people at Anito too. So I don't think I'm gonna cover everything, but I just wanted to walk you through how we built this library and how and what we have to do to get it working. Okay, so I mentioned HTTP is the fundamental unit of the web. So the first thing we have to do is actually model the HTTP protocol. We do this through a wonderful class called HTTP context. Technically, we use the system.web's version of it, but we don't have to because we really only use two aspects of this particular class, and that is request and response. There's a lot of other attributes to HTTP context, such as I know offhand there's HTTP context.current. We have never used that because we just never needed it. And after looking at some of the .NET Core and ASP.NET Core stuff, turns out that was a really good idea because ASP.NET Core's version of HTTP context does not contain .current. So by just modeling this very, very minimal piece of the web, what this is. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this class. Have you used .NET web stuff enough to know what HTTP context is?
Yeah, but before going further, I would like to ask or confirm if this is a .NET standard-based library or this .NET full-based library.
Our web framework, it doesn't. It could be either. So this is just the the structure of it. Mm-hmm. But currently, it is .NET 4 or .NET 4.5. But getting it into .NET Core or .NET Standard, I don't actually know what it's called, though, is trivial. We just changed, when we compiled it, it just works. But our products are .NET 4, so technically it's .NET 4. But yeah, so basically all we use with this is, and if it were ever to go away, or if we ever didn't take a system.web dependency, we would just write our own HTTP context. It's very, very simple. It just has two key properties: the request stream and the response stream. As we said, that's the fundamental aspect of HTTP. Incoming requests with headers, outgoing requests also with headers. These classes really, really beautifully model it. So once we have this HTTP context and a request and a response stream, the next thing that we have is what we call a simple handler. This models the most fundamental aspect of the web, which is processing an input stream and then outputting to a response stream. Exactly what would happen in a Perl script 20 years ago, and exactly what's going to happen 20 years from now, no matter how you're doing web stream-based development. It's very simple. This is kind of some of the parts of the simple handler. but basically you can see we just have one method called process request, and you can sort of see as a developer now, if you want to, how you can use some of these things. By default, it will output in text encoding. By default, it uses UTF-8, but changing these to any other format is just overriding these properties in a class. Same thing, error handling by default is just going to set the status code to 500 and then write the exception to text. But if you as a developer want to write a different version of it, then you can. So let me show you how to do hello world using a simpler handler. It's very simple. This is the code that you have to do with it. So the first aspect to note about this is, you see we have the URL routing. We just have always called that canonical URL because that's what we call it. So this class will now listen for a request to hello world. And when it processes that request stream from HTTP context, you just write out hello world. Now, there's another very important aspect of this library, though, that we can't really enforce through compilers so easily. But I want to point your attention to this build URL function. So what this does is every single handler has to have one of these methods, just called build URL. And you'll note that all it's doing here is doing, it's calling our library, HTTP args, building a URL using generics to pass in that. You can probably guess that behind the scenes, what this library is doing is it will just output, if any method anywhere were to call build URL, it would just return the canonical handler / hello world. This comes into play a little bit later. So what happens with our AH web library if we want to add a parameter to a web handler? It's very simple. We do this. I shortened some of the code a little bit, but if you wanted to do hello name with this, we'll just give a hello there as the URL here. And now we have a name argument. Again, I have no idea if this is similar at all to how Web API works. Somebody said that it was. But what we have is a public class now. We just have given it an attribute that says name is a required query string argument because you know, you can say it's not required. Optional is one of the attributes of query string, of that attribute. So all it's doing now is just doing context.request.write this.name. So the code that you have to write to wire up a very simple handler is simple. The part I don't like so much, but we're limited to what we can do inside of C#, is the way that we build this URL. You can just see if you want to find what the URL, if you need to get the URL for this page, all you have to do is called build URL and then pass in the name that you will use to this. So if you were to do build, hello name handler dot build URL Alex, it would generate hello there question mark name equals Alex. That's how you call pages on the web. So this gives us this functional cohesion. This particular pattern looks strange, but I'll explain why we keep using it later. But all it's doing is basically generating URLs using this pattern. And it's static, so you can't do anything other than things that can be done statically, like construct strings. Some of the other things, so everything we do is very, very attribute driven. So you already know how the canonical URL works. You can probably guess what alternate URL does. So if you specify an alternate URL, you'll notice there was a typo, and this just allows you to redirect. This is a permanent redirection. When you have a web framework where you don't ever have to worry about URLs between pages, you don't ever really need to worry about redirections because everything is statically linking. But this alternate URL is useful for when you build an API library, or maybe you have to change, maybe you made a typo in an API that's public, and now you have to, flip it there. Other interesting parts about this library, though, is you'll see now this is why we have it as a product company. The secured task required. So how this works, very simple. If you try to go to this handler, if a user were to just type in hello there, and they are not authenticated, and they don't have that secured task, manage infrastructure, the underlying web framework will just bounce them right back to the login page or to not secure page, something like that. It depends on the context, obviously. But at a higher level, as a developer, all you have to think about is which secured task is required for this particular handler. It simplifies security checking all throughout. The other thing is licensing. All our products are commercial products that you require a license for. So if you don't have a license key installed, it's a problem. So how we manage that is most handlers do require licenses, obviously, but what about the thing that lets you enter the license in? Obviously, that shouldn't require a valid license. So all we do is tag some pages with license not required.
So what do you mean license here?
Like, so you in our software, like in Buildmaster or ProGit, you have to enter in your license key on the admin side, and then hit like save, and it activates your software. As a developer, though, not all pages should require a license. Some should, but some shouldn't. Like browsing the feeds page, of course, you need a license for this. And this is it could be the free version of our software license. It could be the enterprise version. It's just the license key. So yeah, sorry, I mean the license key. And if anyone has questions at any time, please just keep asking. So yeah, so the license for us is a business rule. If the user of our software who's accessing this page, if their configuration of our software doesn't have a valid license, this page won't work. Makes sense. Most people don't develop software products, so they would never need anything like that. But maybe secured task required would be important. I don't know.
So it's like the authentication required attributes whenever you accessing the page without login, it may be redirect to login page.
Yes.
For this one, if I accessing, if no license entered yet, going to the license entering page or something, right?
Exactly.
Configuration.
Yeah, exactly. It goes to the license require, or it will by default redirect you unless you have this attribute. And I think, again, I don't really know like the new versions of it. I never paid attention to MVC too much other than just watching .NET meetups, because I've only developed at Anito, right, for the past so many years. I guess it's not dissimilar to how MVC and, right, do you do this? Yeah. Now, keep in mind, we've been doing this since .NET 2.0. So it's similar, and one of the reasons that there's familiarity, but that familiarity has caught up to us. And now as new things come, we'll adapt it. But you see, if you remember in .NET 2, heck, even ASP.NET 2, this wasn't there at all. So you were supposed to specify authentication in the web, in web config, if I remember correctly, you had all that authentication. But yeah, we've always done this like this. So one of the cool things that this does when you use attributes and you use the static is we do static verification. So obviously the compiler takes care of most things. If you can't make a typo on a URL because it's all static. All the attributes help. What we can do though is we have a very simple verifier that we just pass a assembly to, and it will actually go and check every single handler to make sure that it has a build URL method that has that one method in it and follows those rules. It's very, very simple validation. It's not compile time, but it's static verification. And what's really cool is that we can, at any time in our software, just generate a report of every single possible page access point, the URLs, the arguments, the license required, and the security required. That's good for just a quick security check to say, oh, what tasks are required for this page? So it makes auditing internal. It's not for customers. It's just, how would you ever else find out every single, we have 300 pages in Buildmaster alone, or 300 different handlers. So that's a lot to manually do. All right, so that's the basics of how we just handle basic HTTP, processing a stream and then unprocessing a stream. Now, how did we model HTML? And you're seeing now, like I mentioned, this is very similar to MVC, but built from the ground up. So here's how we model HTML. We have a very, very simple interface called iSimpleControl. And it has a single method in it called write HTML. This is, I think, actually what the literal interface is, maybe without curly braces. And we, of course, don't use HTML text writer because it's not good enough for whatever reasons, but probably because it has too many dependencies and isn't fast enough. So we wrote Slim HTML text writer, which is just a faster, better version. Again, for our specific purposes. I'm sure HTML text writer is fine for the general, but product company special rules. So literal HTML, this is another class that we've created. So it is a simple control. You're seeing that it's got two properties. So it's got a constructor with text and an optional write encoded. The string property of text implicitly converts to and from a string. So anyone want to take a stab as to what the code behind write HTML might look like? I don't actually have the code, but I should have put it on here. All write HTML does is do one thing. If write encoded, then probably does it in one line, right? But like, if write encoded, then HTML encode write the text. Else write the literal text. So all this thing does, this is nothing but a string wrapper with built-in HTML encoding. So far, it doesn't seem very useful at all. But do pay attention to these literal conversions here, or these implicit operators, because what you can do with this now is anytime you need to convert a string to a literal HTML piece, you can do that because thanks to C#'s power of implicit operators. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The next important part that we use to build, to model HTML is the iSimple control container. So all this is a interface called a simple control container that has one single method on it, returns an enumerable of simple controls. And this container has a reference to something that owns it. So you can now picture you have a container. You can have an interface for a container that contains a bunch of child elements. What we then do is we add a property to this iSimple container, which basically points back to the container. So by doing this, what we can now do is generate a simple control collection by just implementing this interface. Actually, this is one of the actual interfaces in our web framework. What happens is when you add an item to a simple control container, the add method, the logic is very, very simple. It has an internal list, but if the control is already associated with another container, it throws an error. Because you can't have in HTML, I mean, think of the document object model. Every single node in HTML belongs in exactly one place. So we use a very simple model to do this. When we put these two things together, we get the element class. The element class implements a control and a control container. The properties of it, so you can already start to see maybe how some of this stuff works here. Inputting in the element type, this could be like this could be an H1, this could be a div, this could be anything, right? And then the content of that control. Two important elements to this are the element type, which could be div, could be span, H1, any valid HTML, or probably invalid HTML. I don't think we validate it. And then an attribute collection, which is just a key value pair, text value of just attributes. So very, very simple. You can picture probably what the write HTML, because remember, all simple controls have a single method, write HTML. All that this does is write out something like this. For each of the attributes, write it out as first write the element type name, then for each of the attributes, write a key value pair. Then iterate over the child control collection and write out that element tag. Simple, simple way of doing it.
What's this content?
Content? Which one?
In the constructor.
That will come in later. What content, actually, no, that's not true. What content does is, so yeah, I should take a note of this. Let me, I'm gonna take a note. We need this to help also developers, so, because no one, yeah, this is like a lot to pick on. So what is content in element? Okay, that's a good question. So content is so if you pass in div and then hello world, it is a div with the content of hello world. So the content is the content of the element. Actually, this pattern is very similar to if you ever use XDoc, which is the XML framework that was introduced in .NET 4, maybe. Anyway, it's very similar to that, which is just passing in this. This does break our strongly typed rule, though, because it's an object. So we have to be careful with that. But technically, there's 3 constructors, but it's so you can, and I'll show some examples of it, but yeah, this is just so you can pass in 0 or any number of content pieces. The things that you're supposed to pass in are other controls, basically. So inside of an element should have content, so you can do that. So I'll show you what this looks like here, though. Oh yeah, other helpful properties on an element. So we have ID, style, class, classes. All that these things do is read and write that attributes collection. So we know ID is a very important part of HTML, so it's a explicit .NET property. We also have some useful properties in here: inner HTML, inner text, and toString. These are primarily used for rendering stuff outside of like a web, outside of Slim HTML writer. So for example, if you're debugging or you're writing a utility that you just want to like write HTML text with, use those useful properties. So here's how these come together. Okay, so take a look at div. Like I mentioned, we have a div class here. Div will just take the div class inherits the all of these inherit element. So div class, you input any number of content items and then just pass in. It just creates that element and simplifies it. H1, same sort of thing, but it uses H2. The IMG class, this only has 2 constructors, right, or 2 arguments of the constructor, source and alt, because that is basically what an image tag needs. So instead of images are not allowed to have child content, just that's an HTML rule. So our image simple HTML class does not allow it. It's just source, alt, and then it will write that out. Of course, it has, like all elements, it will have a attributes collection. It will have a classes collection. So if you need to add something else to image that's, I don't know, some other class, some other property I can't think of, you would do that with attributes. The A, which is just the simplest of classes, the link that it goes to, the text, the params, and you can start to see how this stuff works. It's not dissimilar to .NET, to ASP.NET's web controls, but what they did is they used a lot of bizarre abstractions. Like if you remember, it wasn't called A, it was called link or something like that. I don't know, it's been a while. It wasn't called IMG, it was called image. And it wasn't alt, it was text. So as a developer, you had no idea, how these work. Our simple HTML classes are as close to real HTML as possible. But what the most important thing is these enforce consistent and proper use of HTML. Oh, yeah, just pseudocode. Yeah. Actually, I think the real version of these classes have like 3 constructors for ease of developer use. So, but yeah, it should do that. But yeah, good catch. Thank you. Okay, so once we have simple page, so we have this. All we now have with this is we have a way to model HTML. It's just using a simple control and then elements that can nest each other. So far, this models 100% of the web. So far, we're at modeling all of HTTP, which is the input-output stream, and then modeling HTML, which is a hierarchical collection of elements. Good, we're there. Now, how do we model this next aspect of the web? This is where pages come in. Users expect and demand pages. So our web framework models pages. It uses something called the simple page to do that. So what it does is all pages are a simple handler. So the simple page base class just simply inputs it inherits from simple handler, which just processes a request. All handlers do is just process requests. But what we do to the page class is we add 2 important properties to it: a head content and a main content. These are just two control collections. If you think about it, pages don't actually have a page in and of itself isn't an HTML document necessarily, or we didn't model like that. What we did is with this we have two pieces: the head and the main, because all HTML looks like this: HTML, then it has a head, and then it has a body. There's nothing else. HTML has been like this for 20 years. It's going to be like this for 20 more years. But it's important to differentiate these two control collections because usually you don't have to add stuff to the head when you're developing web pages, but sometimes you do. Usually you're writing it inside of the body. So that's why when you do this, it works like this. And you can maybe already sort of picture how the code might work. It just writes out HTML, maybe the XML, NS, whatever, iterates the head, iterates the contents of the body, like that. Simple page, so some important parts of simple page features. So we're now at a class that just has these, that's a simple control. The important things to note about the simple pages, we added a title property. What this does is this automatically renders the title tag, because that's kind of a pain to do for every single page, is add to the head content, a title element, and then deal with it that way. So we followed that. That was borrowed from ASP.NET's idea because people like page titles. It's important for bookmarking. You can also specify title as a attribute too, because we love attributes. We have, instead of having developers write to the process method, what we do to the process request, you get a initialize method to call. So what you do in here, as a developer, you have to override this initialize method, and what that does is that now allows you to start adding controls to the main content. The idea is that in the main content, you just pop all your controls in there. You can also use a template, like because obviously, you don't want the page to just write out this very boring thing. So Simple Page has a templating feature built in. It's a very, very naive templating library, nothing complex. It may as well, it's not, but it may as well be as simple as string replacement like that. Obviously, we have some other very tightly integrated product features. All of our products have this concept of a modal page. We call it modals, but it's kind of like a pop-up window inside of your browser, right? Everyone knows what these are like. When you click a link, sometimes it does that. For us, every single pop-up is its own page. The user doesn't know that, but it is. We use an iframe to display that. That greatly simplifies development. Modal pages also have the ability to just picture, like on a page now, normally you just write out the page, but if it's a modal page, you can just do save to the database and then page.close or something like that. When you do that as a developer, the page automatically closes. Obviously, we also have some special controls because sometimes you want to add the navigation, tell who the current user is. It's very, very product-specific things. So here's what it looks like if you want to do hello name with a very, very simple page. So I mentioned you've got canonical URL is there. So you can already see this is basically like a simple handler, right? You still have to put a canonical URL on it. Still has your name attribute, still building the URL exactly in the same way. But here is how you build out these, here's how you build this. This is the initialize method. And what we're doing is just adding a single div that says hello this.name. So it's super, super simple to make static HTML, to make pages. You could basically use this to generate HTML pages very, very simply. Does the model make sense? I think I'm not showing enough examples as I'm running through it now. I think I might add that to my list to show more.
Seems like so far it's been a lot of how to construct and deliver static pages.
Yes.
Do you do any dynamic pages in this one?
Well, keep in mind you could do dynamic pages, right? Because this is technically dynamic. Yeah,
I'm
but
thinking more like JavaScript.
yes. But before you get to JavaScript, so what you're talking about is interacting with the user. So yes, so far we have built up, so what we've built up so far is HTTP, the basics. then we built up the HTML document tree, and then the very basic concept of a page, which is nothing more than a way to render. It's to combining an HTML model with an HTTP request. Easy. So the first thing that we need to do, though, before JavaScript is user input. So this gets a little bit more complicated, but I want to walk through how, to understand user input, it's really important to go back to the basics of HTML and HTTP. In HTML, again, I use this because it's fun, but it has always been like this. You have forms in HTML that use a method. It's always post, could be get, but let's just say it's always post, right, to a action. Back in the day of the CGI bin days, you would never post to the same page. You would always post to a CGI bin. That page would do the processing and then redirect you to some other HTML page. That was just how it worked back then. I guess that's how some people do some coding now, is they post to a something and then they redirect to a display page. I don't know. But anyways, no matter how you do it, you could do this in just pure HTML, right? What the browser does when this is in HTML, it will, when the user hits a submit button, and you only have one submit button that you're able to press as a user, by the way. There can only be one button that triggers a form post, just HTML rule, 20 years. It will do this. It posts, it uses this sort of HTTP 1.1, which I guess 20 years now, HTTP 1.1, still not 1.2 yet? Is it?
Yeah.
I've heard that 10 years ago, so maybe next decade, 2030? Yeah.
I think it's really starting to come.
Okay. So next 5 years then, in 5 years, we may see yeah. But anyway, it always does this X, whatever this, and it just always puts it inside of this, in this URL encoded key value pair with every single input that has a value and the single button that you use to submit it. It's always been like that. Doesn't matter what technology you're using, that's how forms work. So what can we do to process from HTML? It's the same as 20 years ago, same as today. There will always be in an incoming post request from a browser, there will always be some sort of encoding. URL encoding is usually what's being done, but when files are posted, it uses a different encoding that I forgot the name of. Multi-part, yeah, right, and it's some encoding. It's all, but HTTP requires plain text, so it's got to be encoded. You know, web browsers will only send the name of input. You cannot get a browser to send anything else, no matter how hard you try, with a form, but the exact name and value pairs. Rendering a page has always been a pain. So if you want to make a form and then do something like I don't know. So you've got a form, the user submits the form, and then it was a required field, but they didn't do it, or it's an edit page, and you want to show them the form fields that they edited. It's always a complete pain. I guess, I don't even know what language this is, but you would have to do something like this. You would, back in the whatever, ASP, whatever days, maybe this is PHP, it doesn't matter. You'd always have to embed like this. In ASP.NET, they had some nice attributes, but it's always been difficult to get the user input to match. I really like ASP.NET's model of how they innovated with this postback, and how that works is something that we basically modeled as well. So yeah, we reinvented that wheel as well. So here's how it works. If you want to now make a interactive web page with simple with a simple page on AHWeb, so already we know this this build URL stuff. There's no input to this, but you know it's a simple form. So now that we're digging into this initialize method. So the first line here is building a simple input. I actually don't know if that's the name of the class. It might be called input, but I didn't have time to actually get it. But anyway, you build a input, and note here we're saying required equals true. Then the F name, for whatever reason, the last name is not required. We now add this to our control tree, first name, and I'm using the exact same bad HTML that was done in that previous example just to show how easy it is to do. First name, we would not do this, but first name, so this is now where you start seeing how the content array works, right? First name, this is converted because it's a string, it will get converted into literal HTML. That's what allows it to be rendered as inside of a control hierarchy. The F name is a simple input you can guarantee is a type of simple control. BR, you can imagine that is just an element with BR and a self-closing. Same sort of thing. But then we have another thing called post back button. I realize I forgot to give it a name. The button should have like submit or some user text on it. So I should add this page. But what we're doing inside of this method here is this syntax is like inline delegates. Is that what you call them? I forget the name of it, but lambdas, thank you. That's what I was looking for, yeah. So this is a lambda expression that we're passing into this post back button. So what will happen now is this page will display on the first time this page is rendered in a GET request, which is all things in the browser, always GET, it will just display the HTML that we saw earlier. First name, last name, the stupidest simple form. But when the user clicks that button, the simple page framework will detect that button click. Then it will allow you to do whatever you want. In this case, save the name, fname value, last name value. No good reason to do that. And then redirect to a different page, right? This doesn't matter. Anything you want to do can be done. The key things to note, though, is this field. Because this says required equals true, and you're specifying it right here, you'll get two pieces of validation. Number one, there'll be some kind of JavaScript validation that's automatically wired up by the web framework. It will render something that, I don't know, makes it red or does an asterisk or lets the user know that, hey, this was a required field and it's now red, you didn't enter it. It will also automatically render in that same exact method if the user, for some reason whatsoever, disabled JavaScript, or if the JavaScript had a bug. Right? So this handles both server-side and client-side validation all at once. Of course, this can only work for simple validation. Required fields, regular expressions, numbers, dates, so on and so forth. But this was a nice thing that allowed us to get both server-side and client-side built in.
Okay, so I just want to double confirm, even though it says page,
yeah,
this is kind of a combination of the controller and the view generator?
I guess so. Yeah, this is a single page that may as well be a controller, a view model. It's all built in one. It's very similar to ASP.NET's page model, which had everything as one. Yeah. So where did I go? Oh yeah. So how we did this. So in order to do that, and the way that works in ASP.NET is they created something called postback, which was a great idea. I just wasn't happy with the implementation of it. So in order to re-implement postback, we had to really think about how postback works and how to do it. So the first thing to keep in mind is that there's user input fields. So what I mean by this is no matter any type of input that's in HTML, you will have these will always be key value pairs returned back to the server. A checkbox always will have a name and a value. It doesn't really matter, but every single input that represents a field is always going to be a simple key value pair. The next thing to model is, and there's a form can have a lot of them, right? Form can have 100 inputs or could have 1. The other thing is a form always must have an input event too. So this is triggered, well, not always, but a form will have a user. When a user clicks the submit button, what happens is the browser will always send name, my button, and value. It will always send those in that URL encoded post. So we also, as I mentioned, re-implemented field validation on both of those things. We also built, as part of our post-back processing, there is no cross-site request forgery because we prevent that from happening. But a cool thing, too, with our framework is you never have to worry about the name field. In fact, if you look at this HTML here, this is just a variable name. In fact, you have no idea, like this local variable never is written out to HTML at all whatsoever. When you know, who knows what the ID is? It doesn't matter. That's not your problem as a developer. So this got a lot more complicated to do. But So the simple pages process request method, in order to implement postback, the first thing we already talked about is we initialize the control tree. So, or the user enters all of their controls, which we saw in that method. You put in all your whole control trees, all your input. The first thing that happens, after you create the control tree, the next thing that we do is process the tree. So we scan and we traverse the entire tree, this long complex control tree, and say, hey, are there any input controls, all whatsoever? Right, because note, back on here, you are not even specifying a form. We have abstracted that from the developer. There's not even a form tag at all whatsoever. So the first thing we have to do then is we will, if there's any fields, then we know we need to generate a form as part of the framework. If you have a name, great. If you don't, though, we will just simply generate a name based on the position in the hierarchy. Start with AH, because why not? And then just use tildes to specify the position within the control tree. And then, if it's a post request, if it's a post, we know that the user is posting back, right? We know that the user has submitted input against this page, so it's no longer a GET, it's now a post. While we're traversing this control tree, if it's a post request, we will look inside of that form fields request, right, which is the key value pair of name and values, and we will simply assign the values to whatever the user submitted. If, however, it's an event, like a button, then we'll note, hey, it looks like the user clicked a button. Let's remember the name and value of the button that they clicked for later. Okay, so we note those. Then we actually process the postback. That's where we validate that hidden CRF token. If it's there, we perform all of the server-side validation. And if there's any errors, we'll just drop them in some sort of validation array. We'll let the developer of the page deal with validation errors however they want. That's not the simple pages problem, but we just note what the validation errors are. Then the next step is to process the input event, that input submit button, right? We only process this if there's no validation errors, because you don't want to process an invalid post that would go against validation. And then all we do is, if the errors are 0, then we run the delegate attached, or the lambda. It's really a delegate, whatever. We run whatever delegate method that input button requests us to do. At that point, one of the things that this delegate could do is lose control, which could do a context response redirect. That causes the whole, then we don't write out the HTML, right? That just is handled differently. So this is potentially an exit method for the page, but otherwise we write the HTML, but if form required is true, then we wrap the entire body inside of a form. So let's see if I have examples of this. Yeah, I can show some of the things here too. These are implemented all through some interfaces. So we have a very, very simple post control. So a post control is any kind of control that will support a postback. So that could be basically any input, right? It could be a text box or it could be a button. Each control dictates whether it participates in the post. Usually, and almost always, the key of the post control directly relates to the name attribute. I think it's always that, I don't know. We let each control that we create, like the text box, is able to set, the framework knows the name and value pairs, but the control is responsible for setting its own value. So if it's a checkbox, for example, checkboxes are simply true and false. So inside of the checkbox control, the set value method will just say, oh, does this value was submitted? I guess then checked equals true. Drop-down lists, it's always selected index. So in this case, the selected index, selected value, this maps it right back to the control using that. And then buttons need this, right? Like if it's a valid post, then the event is processed. So you can now start to see how this button class is built. If it's participating in the post, then this method will be called. Other classes, we will also have things that can process regardless of input. So this is I can't remember what this thing's actually used for, but what this allows you to do is now just listen to post-back events. So if you add, this is all simple controls will do this, but what this now allows, oh yeah, this allows a control to process the validation. So for example, let's say you have a button that now needs to check the validation results. It is now able to check the validation results that the page found and adds to the array or something like that. That one's a little more complicated, but let's see. Validation is handled by the same way. So any field that, or any, we do validation with these very simple fields, right? It's required, it has a specific type of validation, number, double, currency, date, something like that. Could be a regular expression, maximum length, and then if it's a problem validating, what is the message that's displayed? Then all these things start, the validators add to it. So all these things basically add up to how we perform validation in this simple web. So far, I think it's a lot of fields here, but any questions? Is this sort of adding up, like how these parts are coming together? What I want to show some code to how this stuff is used. Okay, lastly, this is where we're getting into more JavaScript, right? This is how we start implementing, like how we can actually start getting JavaScript. We use Knockout for like really highly interactive controls. So side-by-side resources are a big thing because we know C# isn't nearly enough to do all this development. So what we have is every simple page can have side-by-side resources to it. So right next to my page, you can have your TypeScript file, which is just JavaScript, your less file, which is CSS.
Or maybe cs.c.
Oh yeah, actually, it compiles right to that. I think .css might be. I don't know if it's supported or not. It probably is.
It would be funny just .cs.css.
What I really hoped is that Visual Studio would allow you to like expand those in like a little plus tree, but it doesn't. We tried that, but you can see it right in the solution. And then, so how it works is basically the logic is this: if the file exists, so as a developer, all you have to do is add that file. If it exists, if you have a custom JavaScript file or a custom CSS file, it's automatically inclused. That's a keyword at page load time. Hardly any page uses it, to be honest, though, because most pages are just simple input-output events, so we don't really use it. But the few pages that do, it's critical to do, and we would be completely screwed without it. How Knockout works. So Knockout, I don't know how to describe it. Is it people use Knockout still, right? Is it popular? Oh, I thought people knew not. I guess Knockout's like a web, like it's Angular. It's like one of those HTML. Thank you, data binder. Yeah, yeah. It's basically a way to do very dynamic HTML. Like, I don't know if I have an example of it, but maybe. Yeah, on the next page I have it. But basically, a Knockout is data binding. It's basically you have an HTML and then you have JavaScript, and it kind of binds to the JavaScript model. So if you change the HTML input, then it automatically changes the model. And if you change the model, it automatically changes the page. It's a really, really nice way to do a small portion of a page in there. But I guess model binding is what all the web frameworks do. So how we do that, though, is we just simply use the Knockout container, which is a simple control that if it will write out this embedded HTML, and then it will execute a JavaScript function that will bind against the specified view model, which is a Knockout way of doing it, or just invoke some JavaScript function. So depending on it works. So yeah, putting it together, it looks like this. So you build like a Knockout container, and you'll see that this is what the HTML looks like. It's very simple, like this whole Knockout. This is the Knockout syntax, I guess, and it's probably not dissimilar to all the other ones. It's just data binding, I guess. There's a Java, you can see here, there's also a JavaScript file. This is advanced settings? No. Yeah, something like that. Anyways, there's a CS file, a less file, an HTML file. So this one uses it all, but all that we're passing in from the server side is what is the admin page's URL. Now this one, we have a method here. So on the admin page, you can actually restart the service, and that will stop the Windows service, wait, restart. And what that does here is you'll note this uses the library dynamic HTTP handling, and it's getting a data URL for a delegate method called restart. So we're now actually passing to the JavaScript. I don't know where it gets bound here, but somewhere on the page, you will click this and it will take you to a handler that will execute this C# method on your page. It could be anywhere, right? It's a delegate. Same thing here. This now gets a URL for change setting, which this is where we're losing our strong typing, but it takes it input and output. And then presumably this URL is now generated in the JavaScript, so you never have to worry about page URLs again. So how are they enclosed? It gets really complicated because less and TypeScript have to be compiled, right? On debug builds, we have a special handler. So this is like if you're doing local development, we only use debug builds for local workstation. The handler listens to something in resources. Maybe it compiles TypeScript. Maybe it runs the less compiler. In early versions of Visual Studio, this was required, but I think Visual Studio automatically compiles TypeScript now. But in any case, it just returns whatever the file is on disk. So when you have the web application running, you just edit the CSS file, and you can hit the refresh or something like that without rebuilding. On release build, before linking, so after doing all the compiling and right before linking all the different pieces, Incluser will basically zip up all of the CSS, TypeScript, HTML, content files, image, logos, everything, right? Anything that is left, it will drop them in this zip file. This zip file gets embedded in the assembly, and then we have a special handler that just streams these out. So when you look at our products, what you end up looking at on disk is like the web folder just has a bin in it. There are no logo files. There are no CSS. There's nothing. It is just basically a single, not a single, but it's just a bunch of assemblies in a web config file. That's it, nothing else. Everything's built in there. We do that for several reasons. One of it is to get, so that we don't have to, because it's pre-compressed, right? So we get pre-compression in here. But also we don't want users thinking they can modify the files. They don't get to replace the logo. They don't get to edit some JavaScript files to work the way that they do. You can guess where we got that idea from. Users would do that. Like they'd be like, oh, yeah, I noticed like when I upgraded Buildmaster, what the logo changed. Why would you replace the logo on disk? It's a sell product. So no, not allowed. So we enforce that by embedding everything in the assembly. It confuses users a lot because they're like, where's all the files? All I have are these bin files, but that's how it works.
Does it work? It's not complaining.
Yeah, they're like, well, I don't, but where's the logo? I want to replace the logo. Do you?
Huh. The $5,000.
Feature request form, yeah. That's our Ultra Enterprise. We didn't build it yet, but will if you give us enough money version, yeah. So anyways, there's some other interesting AJAX features too that we have here. So this is where it starts getting into like more like a real web framework, right? So this knockout stuff allows you to do HTML and some of that. There's some cool AJAX features in here like partial rendering. I'll run through this stuff real quickly. We already know that we have a process request method, but it writes the entire content tree. But we could actually just write a portion of the tree if we know specifically which control to do. So what we can do is, if we know the control's ID, then as a header, an HTTP header, we can just say, hey, why don't you partial render this control? So what happens now inside this method is partial render value, right? If this HTTP header exists, then full render, which will render the control tree as normal. if not, if we've got this header, then basically what partial render will do is it will locate that control in the control tree, and starting with that portion of the page, it will just render that down. So that's cool, but where does that come in? Let's see if I have an example. Oh yeah, the only requirement for this partial rendering is that you specify an ID or say, hey, I want this control to automatically have an ID. Here's how it works. The request normally, like we have a page called partial render. Normally it will write out your whole HTML like this, right? Div ID equals my ID. But if you pass in this special partial render header called my div, you now get a completely different response. ID equals my div. It's just a small portion of the page. Okay, so that's cool. But where this gets used is here. We use this in conjunction with JavaScript, Ajax, XHR, whatever you want to do. And from a developer standpoint, it requires almost no JavaScript to get some basic functionality. It provides using this technique, we have a pretty decent user experience, like B+, right, for some of the stuff. Let's say example use cases. Simplify auto-refreshing of a page. So picture now you have a control that you just want to refresh constantly. Like every 5 seconds, update this portion of the page. With this partial rendering and post back, it's just specifying, hey, refresh this portion of the page, and it generally works, right? I mean, it doesn't, if it's just a small section of the page, no problem whatsoever. If it's more use the knockout, right? Because that's more complicated to do. This one's really, really helpful. This has been one of our best use cases for this so far. So we have a lot of tables, data tables, and then we have these drop downs, right? So what we do is we change a drop down, and a lot of times we don't display the full data set, and we allow you to search all sorts of things. So what happens is when you are on that page and you specify a different search query, what the JavaScript, it's a very little bit of JavaScript. It simply rewrites the query string. Like let's say you had a drop down that had count 25. You want to show 25 things that start with hello, and I only want to see the type of something. So in this case, maybe it's the top 25 packages that start with hello and are NuGet. Maybe that's what you want to display in your search data table or your search. All we have to now do is have a partial render version of that table, just look at that query and post it right back. The user cannot tell that that's happening. All they see is they change the query, they change that drop-down box, the URL automatically changes so they can bookmark that query. If they hit refresh, it works normally. It doesn't say, do you want to submit a post, right? When they hit refresh, it's exactly what they submitted, all built in, right? Because we have this. And, for most, like I said, 95% of the time it works and gives a solid B+. Action posters are another cool thing that we have. It's like a form post, but using Ajax instead. All it does is it directly executes a server-side method without having to do dedicated handlers. So you saw on that example page, resetting the server by just passing it a delegate. What it will do is all behind the scenes, it will attempt to, I think I have it explained on the next slide, but basically you click a button that says like restart the server. What the web browser will do is generate some JavaScript XHR request and then call whatever method the developer specified. If that handler returns an error, it will just pop up that error as an error. Maybe it will refresh the page. Maybe it will partially render a section of the page. It's pretty simple. And all this stuff is already built in. Security, licensing, anti-cross-site request forgery. Very, very simple. In action, here's a good example of it. So on this page, we have this is the page where you administer and configure the security groups, the built-in security groups in, this looks like Buildmaster, right? So our groups page is a security-based page. You can imagine, right, you have to be able to configure Buildmaster to access this page. Here's a nice page title attribute. Somewhere in this page, we have a method just called this, delete group. Inputs a group name, and all it does, this is it, deletes the group. Just db.users delete group. Whatever group you specify, the user gets deleted. It's an Ajax method, which means that only Ajax methods can be called. But to use this thing, all we have to do is this: create a. This is the important thing. Small delete action button. This is now a simple button. It's this thing right here, because this is a delete button in our software. It's an X, you know. So what it does is you pass in, it's this pattern that we have to use, but basically create, I don't know why it's on 2 lines here, but first thing, create a delegate for the delete group with this input, the current group name. So in this case, if we were to hover over this, I won't hover, but whatever, this link knows that the group we want to delete is called administrators. Probably a bad group to delete, but you know, people do that stuff. But they do get a confirmation, because that's the second argument of the of this action button. It just says, "Are you sure you want to delete the group name? This may impact members' privileges." By the way, just as a small aside, we used to try to auto-detect the administrators group, and thought, boy, if don't let people delete it, or give a special warning and say, "You're about to delete the administrators group. Are you sure you really want to do that?" It had no effect. People still delete the administrators group and lock themselves out. We tried to detect if they're trying to delete themselves. Again, none of it works. So instead, we have a knowledge base. This is just a learning as a product company. Sometimes just deal with documentation, because no matter what we do in the software, they'll never. We even thought of make them type the name of the group to delete it. No one cares. It's easy to fix. Search in Google. How do I get unlocked out of Buildmaster or ProGit? Find the knowledge base article. Go to the service, run this command, and then also it trains you never to do it again. So yeah, anyway, but it does, but we don't like, no one likes accidental deletes, so it pops up this control thing. But that's it. As a developer of our software, all you have to do to get this and the last thing this small delete action button does is it updates this table. So it's a really interesting user experience. Like what'll happen is you click this, it posts back to the server, then it repartial renders this table. It almost feels like it's a real, like, rich web application. It's not. It's using all these tricks behind the scenes to save us from having to actually write any HTML, JavaScript code that none of us want to. So that's basically it. I want to skip the routing because we're running, it's kind of long, but if anyone's curious on how we route stuff, because I wanted to get to the conclusions of this. Yeah. So here's the conclusions. We started in 2007, back before we even built our products, right on top of .NET 2.0. We never built something as fully featured as 2.0. We always reduced the features of the framework that we built on top of. I don't know if you guys even remember data binding. The moment I saw it, I knew it was a disaster and wouldn't do it. I just said, nope, we won't do it. Hated ASPX and ASCX controls. But you know, everything else, the first version of this framework was basically the same thing. What we found over the years is that training developers on how to use our framework was a hell of a lot easier than training them how to build good products. So out of all the things you have to learn when you're a product company, learning how to use our weird framework is easy. Over the years, we've had earlier versions of AHWeb come out. The codicide pattern, I don't even know if this exists anymore. That's here, there. I guess this is gone. ASP not, you know, MVC 1, 2, I think 3 and 4 uses the Razor rendering engine. I've heard it's AMC MVC 5. Is that the latest? I'm not sure. People use web APIs, and now, I don't know, we just haven't had to pay attention to it. Sure, probably, right? I don't, who knows? Kinda, right? Like, this is a level of abstraction we don't even care about anymore. Like, none of us, we have code that we could have 10-year-old code, and as long as we control the framework, it's going to work 10 years from now. So later this year, here's some of our strategic objectives here. We will completely remove all dependencies on ASP.NET. We have some very trivial ones. Like I think we're using the HTML encoding, easy to remove. And then we're just going to build on top of core standard. Jim is the expert on the name of this, so I don't know. Thank you, .NET 5, yeah. It will be trivial to do. Our entire web framework will be safe, and we can now upgrade to that and go to containers if you want. It was the right choice for us. Our lesson was to focus on product, not on frameworks, despite building a framework. It allowed us to focus on the product, not on constantly weathering the storm of technologies. We also got to, big thing, express our strong opinions, which are really my opinions, but they got shared with the whole team and strong as I could. So anyway, that's all I have. Got a lot later, but thank you.
Any questions?
Oh yeah. Went way too long, I think.
When you were sort of showing examples of the simple pages, you sort of build the page up in a very sort of sequential way. You have like input and input, BR. Do you find you lose a little bit of being able to see the hierarchical nature of the HTML? Like you wouldn't say
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, so if you build a giant, ridiculous page like that, then certainly you would. Yeah, like if you want to nest 10 levels deep, but like, I'd say I want to show like, but like, yeah, we don't do that. So, because we instead build a control that contains other controls. I'm sure there are some really bad pages that will do that, but like generally, the controls don't nest nearly that much. And when they do, just generate a function that returns a control, right? So you can already see how you can make a function that will, I don't know if I have any good code to show, but like, yeah, like there's so many, I want to definitely incorporate more examples in here.
And are you sharing the screen?
Maybe. It says Hangouts is sharing your screen, so. Yeah. So like, here's an example of like, I just picked a random page. So you can see, in this case, it's a little bit more complicated than the sample things, but this page is probably, what does this do? This allows you to edit the issue track, or this allows you to edit a built-in issue inside of Buildmaster. Inputs all these things here. Not interesting, you know, another thing that we're going to be changing too, by the way, very soon, which is very important for us. We are going to be specifying builds by build ID across the application. So, because we want to allow people to have builds without releases. All it's going to take is trivially changing these build URLs. But anyways, let's see if I can find where this thing generates the control tree. It's not that bad. We wrap it a little bit more. We have a this must be a pop-up page, so it uses slim form fields and sort of wraps like this. But you can see it's not that bad. Some pages are, the pages that get really messy, we tend to just figure out better ways to do them. But yeah, we try to, basically what we really try to do is keep pages extremely simple. And you can see just, there's a lot of them, right? Some of them are very complicated. Some of them like edit release note, this should be simple, right? Just, I don't know, some of this could be duplicated code. I have no idea how old this code is, but like, there's always room for improvements, but it's always like this, build up your controls here, which I guess is what the controller or the model or the, I don't know what it is. Anyways, you can just see release, build, notes, save. It's either, you know, doing very, very simple things, just calling this and then closing the window once it's done. So yeah, that's basically it.
All right, thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Cool.
Sorry, me. Come on, my slide.
All right, now let me just take over the control. Yeah, microphone is dead.
So yes, all right now. I hope. Please wait. I just make sure. Yeah. All right. So thanks again. And because this is a community event, I think we can say whatever we want to say at our own opinion. I mean, this framework is great when we think about the enterprise grade, the strong grade type web application. The only not concern, but what I really think about this framework is whenever we try to create the web application, this is perfect. Whenever we try to create some different application, like the Xamarin application or the mobile application, what we really need to do is we really need to have the web API backend. Because we want to separate the front end or the view to the backend, because this framework is great to running the business logic as well as generating view, right? But when I want to just running the business logic, because I already have view in some way, native view, WPF, Xamarin, Angular, the Vue.js. So I just want to call the web API to do the logic and get the data back by using the JSON. So I think this framework is great for the specific scenario. And each framework has its own strength and weakness for sure.
I think that one thing I'll add to the thing is, should I use AH Web for my own project?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, if you are building a product for a Meetup.
Right.
And, that's the only use case for it.
Right. So I really want to understand. I mean, the more like what's the benefit and what's the kind of the pros and cons with this framework, because we totally understand the great part of this framework today, and I really want to understand what's the when we shouldn't use this framework instead. That might be the interesting topic, because even though I say we shouldn't use this framework for this particular scenario, it does not mean framework is bad, right? Because each framework has its own purpose. But I love the idea of having all these strongly typed in this way. Yeah, the TypeScript is the strongly. It's not strongly typed. It's gradually typed. The system type system. Yeah, so the TypeScript has its different concept anyway. All right, so thank you for coming today, and that's it for today. And the next one is kind of special event that I'll be hosting the event on 1st August, and which is a combined event between .NET Developer Meetup and Azure Meetup. And we have two speakers from overseas, one from UK, who is a Google evangelist meter, who has been presenting before, actually last year. And we also have another guy, he just asking us to be a presenter who is for the Azure side. So he will present about the Azure security related information. And the one thing I really want to make sure in this community is if we want to have our own isolated event, not combined with Azure, in July, because I have no plan to do anything in July, because the next event is August 1st, depending on these guys' availability. But if we want, we can just having another .NET Developer Meetup in July, maybe 3rd, 4th week. Yeah, so just let me know if you have any opinion. And we're also looking for the speakers or content request at the community. If you have any idea what you want to know, and if you have some content you want to deliver, just let us know so that you can be a presenter. And the presentation level can be anything, level 100 to 500 or 1,000, or I don't care, whatever it was. So just sharing your knowledge. It is very useful to many people, regardless. It is very for the beginner or advanced. It doesn't have to be advanced. Very simple trick helps a lot of people anyway. All right, so that's it for today. And thanks, Inedo, again for the sponsoring the event. And I'm really happy Alex back as a speaker this time. Yeah, and I hope you come back as a speaker next time very soon. And I really need Show to be a speaker as well, actually. All right, thanks for coming. And I just want to take a picture. So let me just stop the YouTube. And Nakamura-san from Hokkaido, thank you for joining. Bye-bye. And I stop.
the broadcasting, stop the